change in a society is usually persona non grata with those who have been the beneficiaries of the system.
Welcome to On the Record, where we break down the policies coming out of Washington and their real world impact, particularly on Black and Brown communities, where we double down here at American Urban Radio Networks. Today, we're talking about what some call environmental apartheid, how Trump's executive orders specifically are rolling back environmental protections, disproportionately, of course, harming marginalized communities, and even erasing the data, proving some of the disparities. Joining me is Reverend Dr. John Robinson, an ordained minister and nonprofit leader with more than 20 years of experience. He serves as president and CEO of the Building Up Our Youth Foundation, senior program director for Smart Surfaces at Metropolitan AME, and vice chairman of the board for the Oikos Institute for Social Impact. His work focuses on climate equity and community advocacy and sustainable urban policy. Dr. Robinson, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ebony. It's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon.
Absolutely. I want to first I use the term environmental apartheid, which I've seen over and over when talking about this issue. That phrase highlights how climate policies reinforce racial and economic segregation. With the recent executive actions by President Trump, how do you see this unfolding in Black communities, and how do you define environmental apartheid?
So I think apartheid is a great descriptor because it indicates the level of intentionality around the public policy that has created the conditions that adversely impact communities of color. And in order to really understand the depth of this issue, we need to go back to the 1930s, really, and honestly, even before that. But if we start in the 1930s with the establishment of the FHA and all of the peripheral things that happened when the FHA was established, redlining and racial covenants came out of the establishment of the FHA. And so people who looked like us were redlined into neighborhoods, which is bad enough, but it didn't stop there because the FHA, mortgage lenders, banks, real estate, realtors, all made designations of neighborhoods after they sort of carved up the map. And so they designated neighborhoods A, B, C, and D, with A neighborhoods being sort of the most thriving, the most opportunistic, D neighborhoods being deemed more risky. And of course, we were redlined into neighborhoods that were designated C and D. Then they went further and decided which neighborhoods, based on those designations, were going to receive investments in green infrastructure, right? Parks, stormwater infrastructure, tree planting, tree canopy. So all of these designations, so when we look at the fact that right now in 2025, if you go to a city like Dallas in the summer, the peak temperature is 20 degrees hotter in Dallas in neighborhoods that are historically redlined and marginalized than it is in the wealthier white suburbs of Dallas. 20 degrees, same time of day, same day, hotter, less safe, less livable. And this has roots going all the way back 100 plus years in terms of public policy. And so when we talk about apartheid, right, apartheid is a government policy system that determines where folks can live, where folks can work, opportunities that are available for folks, investment in infrastructure or not, depending on where the neighborhood is. And so I like the designation of apartheid because it speaks to the ways that public policy has intentionally targeted communities of color and denied investment repeatedly, right? This is not just a Trump administration thing. This
Right.
goes back to 1619. It's got its roots all the way back to Jamestown, Virginia, when the first of our ancestors stepped off the boat. And so when we talk about the ways that this impacts us, it's not just a current impact, right? It has been impacting us for generations.
Absolutely. I will say we did see some efforts. Many of us wouldn't have felt the effects of it until years later, but we saw with with the Biden administration, environmental justice policy efforts, rescinding, but we saw under this administration, Trump rescinded the Justice 40 initiative that had directed 40% of federal climate and clean investments to underserved communities. When we talk about climate, I think people have a hard time kind of getting their mind around how this really affects, on top of everything else that we talk about that we're fighting for, especially now in this time when we're seeing federal workers being laid off. I don't want people to forget even about the environmental part. Uh, let's talk about also some of these real world impacts of these reverses that we are seeing, and what these long-term effects could look like if continued.
Yeah. So there are almost, I tell people, because I'm a recovering pastor. So I spent 20 years as a youth pastor and as a senior pastor. And I am now doing this work around environmental justice because every challenge that I experience as a pastor intersects with climate in some way. So I pastored on the south side of Chicago, um, a neighborhood that is at the same time on the lowest end of some spectrums and on the highest end of others, right? So lowest wealth achievement and wage, highest instances of chronic respiratory disease and hypertension and all of the diabetes, right? So all of those issues, public health is one of the major intersections with climate. And the fact that these policy decisions that have been made and have been reinforced for generations, those impact our health. And so if you cover an inner city, as just an example, with dark, heat absorbing, impervious surfaces, you're going to get higher temperatures. You're going to get higher instances of flooding. What happens when water cools for an extended period of time? You get mosquitoes and malaria and all kinds of other deleterious health effects that are the result of public policy decisions that did not put stormwater infrastructure in some neighborhoods. And literally in New Orleans, one of the cities we're working in now, that in an eight by 8 block radius in one of the neighborhoods in the Treme area of New Orleans, they just decided we're not putting stormwater infrastructure.
Let me just say, when I had to speak at Essence Festival last year, and my Uber driver, it was flooding. I remember it was flooding, it was raining that day. And literally, I've seen it in cartoons, but I haven't really seen it in real life. Literally were the hole, the cover, manhole cover popped up straight up out the ground when it was raining, and the whole town, I mean, it was like nothing was straight. And the Uber driver, he was so angry. He said, "I'm so tired of the infrastructure that we have here in New Orleans." He was like, "It feels like we are drowning, literally and physically. This place has been built poorly and they do not care." And he talked about how those who were survivors from Katrina, all of the respiratory issues that they go through, all of the things and the pollutants that they have to deal with. And he was so angry in this car. And he says, "Sis, can you talk about it? Because I don't think my people get it." He said, "When I tell you we don't honor this earth, we don't honor the earth, we don't honor the people or anything in it." And it just shook me, because when I saw that manhole pop, I was like, what in the world? I had not seen it that way. And it just stayed up. I mean, it literally, the force of that water just stayed up. It was so poor.
Yeah. And so what you've touched on, I think, is something that if it's not flooding, it's some other issue that everybody can relate to, right? And the mistake we often make is thinking that these conditions just arise out of nowhere.
Yeah.
The reality is that they are the fruit of seeds that were planted centuries ago. And so flooding in New Orleans is a major problem. And I would venture to say that when you were there, it hadn't been raining for several days. We're talking about a couple of hours of rain.
Literally, literally a couple of hours. I had to get out, and I decided to walk to my Airbnb, and literally I was from my knees. I had not seen flooding like that. And I was like, forget it. No umbrella is going to help in this situation. It was crazy.
No,
And they
you
were
need
used
a
to
raft.
it.
No, you need a raft, and that's the problem, right? They are used to it, because in New Orleans, and this has happened from coast to coast, north to south. So this is not to say that this is just a New Orleans problem or a DC problem or any
Right.
particular city. A lot of New Orleans is literally under sea level, right? It's below sea
Mm.
level, and so of course it's going to flood because it's under sea level. So when there's any sort of storm, flooding is to be expected. The challenge is that one, we will redline into neighborhoods that are the most flood prone, and B, the infrastructure that supports this, that should remove that and should mediate that, has not been made. Those investments have not been made in those communities, and so you have two sort of perfect storms that have gathered in places like New Orleans, and it's really it's a sad state of affairs that people get used to that sort of dysfunction and toxicity. But that's what is the other alternative? You know, one of my greatest pet peeves during Katrina was people sitting in places that do not flood, lecturing New Orleanians about why they didn't just get out. Why didn't you evacuate?
Come on. Right. Right. You are so right. Whether we're talking about that or whether we're talking about what's going to happen with the fallout of the wildfires that we saw in California.
Yeah, just evacuate, as if.
That is privilege.
Absolutely.
That is privilege. Let's talk about the work that you do and how you're fighting back, and how people need to be informed. This is one of those issues that it's hard sometimes to connect the dots for people and get them to care until you're like, that asthma attack that you're having. Let me show you what that's really connected to, or why the you're living in a cancer valley, or the pollutants, or why they're dumping in your area but not dumping in other areas. What are some of the things that you're doing?
So, as part of the work with the Smart Surfaces Coalition, I represent Metropolitan AME Church, which is in the District of Columbia. And we are partnering with about 40 different organizations, everybody from the American Public Health Association to the American Lung Association, the Harvard Graduate School of Public Health, and a whole host of other organizations who are bringing their collective expertise to this issue of addressing extreme heat. And extreme heat specifically because extreme heat is one of the indicators of livability and thrivability in a community. So if it's literally too hot to go outside, right, a whole lot of things happen. Crime increases, public health, it goes down. People just generally don't feel good about the place they live. And so we're working sort of on two parallel paths. One is around policy, because as I mentioned before, we got into this hole through public policy.
Absolutely.
And, unjust and inequitable public policy. And so then the way to get out of it is through just and equitable public policy, which, given the state of the federal government on February 26, 2025, is a challenge. But it is still a public policy issue. And the good news is that cities and states have a lot of leeway as it relates to policy. Right? The federal government literally, revisionist historians will tell you that the Civil War wasn't over slavery, it was over states' rights. They're right, except it was over states' rights to own slaves. And so the fundamental argument was the federal government cannot tell us what to do, right? And so I think what's happening in this moment is states are revisiting this idea of federalism and are taking policy reins into their own hands and making their own, right? And there's been a lot of lawsuits filed by a lot of state AGs and so on and so forth. So we're working on a policy front on one hand, and then on the other hand, at the same time, Metropolitan AME Church has given grants to churches and smaller community-based nonprofits with the goal of innovating specific, targeted, place-based climate mitigation strategies. So what that looks like in New Orleans, and I talk about a lot about New Orleans because that's one of the cities that we are granting money into. We have funded a small nonprofit that's really dedicated to climate mitigation, urban agriculture, and stormwater, management, because all of those three impact New Orleans in major ways. And so they are doing a bunch of innovative things. One of the things they did with the funding we gave them was to build, or take a lot that had been abandoned and vacant, disused, and turn it into a rain garden. So where flooding is commonplace in New Orleans, this rain garden that they built is able to absorb and redistribute 6,000 gallons of stormwater.
Wow.
So where you would have flooding, now you've got beautiful, lush, native species of plants have returned. It's like a butterfly sanctuary. So you got in the middle of this urban area, butterflies and native birds have returned. So it's just a beautiful sort of what they call a third space in the middle of the 7th Ward in New Orleans. And so we're funding those kinds of projects that put resources into the hands of the residents in neighborhoods that are directly dealing with these kind of impacts that we've been talking about.
And what's the so I want to, before I ask about what policies you really want to see, what about people who will see this, they hear this and they're like, oh my goodness, this is what I want in my community, or they want to partner, or they want to help. How can people connect with you on this?
So I'm gonna give your listeners a website. Go to smartsurfacescoalition.org. Smartsurfacescoalition.org. You can find out about the work that we're doing with this specific project. And then beyond that, what I would say is there are churches and there are small community-based nonprofits in every community that are doing this kind of work. We're working in Jacksonville, we're working in Atlanta, Charlotte, Dallas, San Antonio, and New Orleans. So with this current iteration of the project, we are providing resources into 6 communities that are dealing with various aspects and various contextual challenges around extreme heat and ecological apartheid. Find the organization in your community that's doing this work. Volunteer, write them a check, do whatever you need to do to support them, especially now. Because what I will say is, in this environment, and you know this well, not only is climate under attack, right? Climate deniers, science deniers are now in charge of public policy. The person who heads the EPA is a climate denier. That's bad enough. Even worse, justice and equity and those kinds of things, there is an all-out frontal assault on DEI, on justice, on equity. And so it is now incumbent upon us to really double down on the grassroots approach to this work, right? We ain't no help coming from the Fed.
No, not even from the courts, because don't forget about the Supreme Court decision, that Chevron decision that I was trying to let people know the impact of that, and that allows this administration to then not bring in experts, but bring in who they want to bring in to determine whether or not communities need to translate law and say what things really mean, or what you need for your own states. I'm like, I know it seemed far out to people, but I'm like, y'all, that was so detrimental. Could be for so many of our communities. So all the way up to the highest court in the land, it is a fight, but it's a fight that we've got to be in on.
Here's the equivalent of what that's like. So let's say your insurance company, who in this case is the federal government, said that you no longer needed to consult a physician about your health. But we're going to send somebody that has been loyal to us to evaluate your health. They ain't go to med school. They ain't intern with nobody. But we like them and they like us. And so
they're loyal.
Charge. They're loyal. They say nice things about us in public. So we're going to appoint them as stewards over your health. That's essentially what the Chevron decision did. It gave the federal government license to fire or otherwise, marginalize experts, nonpartisan experts who serve in multiple administrations, have served with Democrat and Republican presidents, unbiased, nonpartisan. Remove them, bring in people who are loyal, and they set the policy standard. It is one of the most nefarious things that's happened that I think you're right has flown under the radar. But the way to fight that is to get engaged at the ground level, because to your point, not only is no help coming from the feds, but in fact, right now the feds are the enemy.
Oof. Wow.
So
Wow.
get involved on the grassroots. Find a church that's doing this work, and there are churches. There's another organization called Green the Church that is doing phenomenal work around helping churches transform themselves into community resilience hubs. Find a nonprofit in your community that is doing this work and do everything you can to support them, because they need it. Federal funds have been frozen, and a lot of these organizations depended on these grants that the Biden-Harris administration made available. All that's been pulled. So you have whole institutions now wondering whether or not they're going to be able even to survive.
Wow. Well, your health is your wealth, and if we really believe that, then we have got to fight on all fronts.
Absolutely.
Dr. Robinson, thank you so much for engaging with us at AURN on this critical discussion. These policy changes aren't just about climate, they're about survival, they're about equity, but they're about the future of our communities. For our listeners, I want you to go visit smartsurfacescoalition.org. Stay informed, stay engaged, and most importantly, stay in the fight. That's all for On the Record. Next time, stay vigilant. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Ebony. It's been a pleasure.